The Psychedelic Report.
Psychedelic drugs
have played their part in America's long, strange trip toward an understanding of mind-altering drugs.
The Psychedelic News.
Leading physicians, scientists, and experts share their wisdom about psychedelic medicines and healing.
50 years ago, psychedelic drugs were at the center of America's counterculture.
The brightest minds in psychedelic medicine. The Psychedelic Report.
We use the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy model that happens to have psychedelic effects that were not predicted when the drug was first developed.
From researchers to investors.
I think the biggest mistake we've made as a culture is the war on drugs.
To physicians to shamans and nonprofit pioneers.
Psychedelic drugs.
Recent research suggests some of them could have legitimate uses.
The Psychedelic News
brings you diverse perspectives from the front lines of this exciting movement. The Psychedelic Report.
The Psychedelic Report was brought to you by Apollo Neuroscience and produced by Future Medicine Media and Foster House Records. Welcome to the Psychedelic Report, your single source of truth for the psychedelic news. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Rabin. I'm a neuroscientist and psychiatrist trained in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy as well as MDMA-assisted therapy. I am here with a very special guest who is a businesswoman and a real innovator in several different spaces and a personal inspiration to me for a program that she created to help struggling kids find their passion through art and music. And it's just really incredible to see what has come from that. And one of the most incredible folks that most of you know who came from that passion of Leila's is Tupac, who is one of our most beloved inspirations in the hip hop community. Who's just an incredibly important figure in the last few generations. And Leila continues to work in that space. She's currently managing Earl Sweatshirt, who many of you also know. And we're going to talk about Leila's background and the role of psychedelics in music culture and hip hop culture. And I'm really excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
I'd love it if you could start out by just telling us a little bit about your story, your background. I know you've talked about this somewhat at other times, but not necessarily through the psychedelic lens. And I'd love it if you could give us a little bit of a picture of what it was like to grow up in your family and how you found out about psychedelics.
Yeah, I was born in 1961 in LA. So I'm a child of the 60s. My mom moved from Mexico, I guess, when she was 8 or 9, and my dad's family came from Poland. So I'm pretty much first generation in this country and definitely very identity challenged. In elementary school, we migrated from South Central, and eventually I ended up in Malibu on the beach. So I had a really interesting journey and migration and examination at a young age of race. My dad was the youngest public defender in the juvenile courts in Los Angeles. And I went to elementary school with predominantly children of color. I was always the palest in the group. And my parents had me pretty young. And so my dad was in his 20s, dragging me in the summer to the juvenile courts. And I would sit in the back of the courtrooms watching my dad fight for Black and brown children. And I remember being 10 years old and asking if white kids got in trouble. And he said that usually white kids that got in trouble had private attorneys represent them. And so at a young age, I began to question race, purpose. Why are we here? What is it that has, my life and my path different than the children I grew up and loved and was surrounded by? And just, even the conversation that was happening in the backdrop of our home, that we would be moving, as soon as we could afford to, we were moving to another neighborhood. So I think that being young and always knowing we were trying to get out of the neighborhood had an effect on me. Just giving you some backstory so when I introduce my experience with psychedelics, it'll make a little more sense. In 1972, I was 12. My dad decided he was going to go into private practice and we were going to move to the West Side. So I went from, 64th in Vermont, if anybody knows Los Angeles, to La Cienega area. And then by the time I was in middle school, we were in the West Side in Santa Monica. And completely different experience. In neighborhoods in the hood, we indoctrinate kids. In privileged neighborhoods, we educate them. And so I want to say that it's a conversation more about privilege than it is about race, but we can't not talk about race without talking about economics. And so I had an experience that had me see two different worlds and, have a really brown mother and a very pale father. And I look a lot more like my father. So I also, in my own home, experienced the difference between access based on race. So my home, more than anybody I grew up around or knew by the time I was in Santa Monica, was a home that always talked about justice. My father eventually became a judge. So justice and the law were dinner table conversation. We moved to Santa Monica, and there was a woman that when I was in middle school made an announcement in the auditorium. Her name was Peggy Shackleton. And she said, she was with the Board of Education, and she said, I want to form a little after school or before school club, and I'm going to give everybody books, and we're going to talk about, things that we don't get in the classroom. And you're all invited. And only 7 of us showed up. And she announced that she was doing this to a whole auditorium full of kids. And the 7 of us that came had no idea what we were coming to, but somehow I had this calling for substance. I wanted to know why I was here and what I was going to do with my life, because I had to do something, and I had to do something about all my loved ones that got left behind in a shitty neighborhood that I still was processing and couldn't understand. Yeah. And so the first book she gave us was Siddhartha. And she told us to go home, read Siddhartha, and write. We would meet again in a week. And so Siddhartha opened my eyes. It was the first book, I'd say, that gave me a different level of substance and this quest that I had that I didn't understand at, 13. So that same year, my other friend that I got close to that came after school, she lived in Malibu on the beach, and her father was a doctor in Watts. And he worked on the ground with a number of doctors in the experimental studies early on with LSD. And he was very close to a lot of the great thought leaders that came out of the 60s and that were really looking at the role of psychedelics and the relationship to consciousness. And I was too young to understand, but I knew it was something special. And so my friend Jamie and I would sneak into her father's stuff, not the drugs at this point, not the LSD, but they had a basement in Malibu that was set up for his studies. And, he had this incredible selection of music and art. And we were like, God, what are they doing down there?
How old are you at this point?
I'm 14 at this point. Okay. And very curious. And so we made a plan. I've never talked about this. This is so funny. That's what I was going to say when you asked me about coming onto the show. I grew up in a time that all of this was stuff we didn't talk about. So I've kind of lived this interesting double life where I've never really shared this part of my life, but it had such a profound influence on what I eventually did. But anyway, we were making a plan to steal some of his stash. And we wanted to know what this thing was that they were taking and experimenting and all these amazing conversations that the adults were having around us. And we had a plan for Thanksgiving one year, like I was going to be 15 by the time we had this plan. So we were going to take her father's acid basically on Thanksgiving and see what it was all about. And I got in trouble and I got grounded. And I couldn't believe my dad could ruin my whole plan. And of course, we couldn't let them know what was going on. And I had to do it when I slept at her house in Malibu. But I had some that she gave me to hold because we couldn't have it in her stuff in Malibu or we'd get busted. So I was so mad at my father that I decided I would try one of the little blue pills by myself at 15. So my first experience was alone at 15 in Santa Monica. And I can't imagine what my dad thought I was doing in the bathroom for 5 hours. But I was staring at the wall, sitting in the bathroom. It just hit me so strong the first time I did it that, I stared at the wall for 5 hours and was like, well, I don't know what I just did, but it was definitely life altering. That was the beginning of me exploring and on a journey to understand psychedelics and consciousness. So yeah, I almost forgot what I was going to say. Her family was an incredible gift to my family at that time. I met Ram Dass because of them. I met so many of the people that we study now through their family. And so, yeah, I forgot what I was talking about. Ask me my next question.
No worries. I mean, you covered everything that I had hoped that you would cover. And it's such an amazing story, how you sort of came into this psychedelic world, because I think it's very unusual for people to have had the kind of access to these things. And especially what you experienced was probably, at the very least, very high quality medicine because it came from somebody who had some clinical or scientific knowledge about the substance, right?
Yeah, he was one of the earliest doctors on the ground with the studies, and they were really seriously doing case studies back then. And eventually we were found out, we got in trouble, and we definitely took her father's stuff. And that affected me so much. I became so crazy when I had kids because I thought, oh my God, if my kids are anything like I was, I can't handle it. So it's funny when I think about it now because I went through hell. My kids are a lot like me. And a lot of the things I did, I would not encourage or suggest. I really did grow up in the 60s and it was a very different time. And so part of what is important for me now is to talk about the responsibility and the intention. And I knew there was something more than just this body. I always felt I was borrowing a body to express love and that, I was wearing this body. And so I felt that when we were watching her father's work and we were going into his stuff, I felt like he knew what I was looking for. I didn't quite understand the substance connection or the plants at that point, but I felt like just with the music that our parents listened to and the role of music, which we'll get to, I just felt like I finally was getting some answers. And the confusion I had about identity, because I didn't really understand, my last name is Steinberg. I struggled with is being born Jewish, a race, a religion, a culture.
Right.
I was trying to figure out, my mom's family were Middle Eastern, Turkish, Latin. Was I Mexican culturally or was it a nationality? And, I was very young trying to answer these questions because people would always say, what are you? And we had such a mixed household. When I did do acid, it was like I entered a world that began to clarify for me that I wasn't any of these things, but I needed to wear my identity while here to start to look at this crazy history we have and how do we heal. And so my early use was intentional. It was us as kids wanting to repeat our parents. My mom was really active in the early organizing for the farm workers and Cesar Chavez, and her activism was politically motivated, and my father's was law and justice. And so I felt kind of this burden to make a difference and somehow bring both those worlds together. But I couldn't figure out what it was that I was supposed to do. And I remember my first 45 I bought was Marvin Gaye when he released What's Going On. And so I went to Montgomery Ward's and bought the 45 for What's Going On. And that soundtracked for me my life's purpose. I wanted to have answers to what's going on. I believed that music could help us have the conversation, and that I had to find my way to what my contribution could be in this life. And so that night that I sat on the bathroom floor and stared at the walls all night, I kept coming to heart work, love. I was breathing love. It was the first time I felt this universal heart. And the walls were talking to me. I was seeing hearts coming off the wall and dripping down. It was just so visceral and strange for me. And, I think I had smoked weed was the only other thing I had done. Never was attracted to alcohol.
You're listening to The Psychedelic Report.
The 60s were definitely sexual revolution. So I had parents that were not very appropriate and experimenting with sexuality and boundaries and relationship. And then on top of growing up in these revolutionary times, then you compound it with the exploration of substance and consciousness. I believe that it was a really important time for the examinations that were happening, but it wasn't healthy for family structure. Everybody that my parents, hung out with and everyone I can think of in their circles ended up divorced. I saw a lot of families fall apart because it was difficult to balance this new sense of freedom and consciousness and love and the need to have structure and boundaries if you're raising children. And so I don't think that my parents were able to manage that in a healthy way. And so my mom ended up moving out. My parents got divorced. By the time we came to Santa Monica, my mom was like, I need to experience life and the world. And suddenly, growing up in a very conservative household, both my parents, they found a new kind of freedom, and it didn't work for them to have a traditional household. I think because of my exploration with the different medicines early, and after that first time that I didn't tell anybody that I did that, then we did it formally. Then my friend and I, we used her father's stuff together. And then shortly after that, her father had a brain aneurysm and died. Suddenly, her mom was raising 3 daughters without their dad and with this huge responsibility of everything he left that had to be hidden and all of the documentations. So I was too young to know all the details now of what all was going on. But Jamie and I took a whole little stash that we kept to the side because we knew it was like gold. One day we'd be glad that we snuck and took that stuff. But when I turned 16, for my 16th birthday, our mothers took us to the desert and gave us shrooms. Now I share this because it's my first time talking about it and I want to be able to be honest. And my dad's passed, so I feel like I can finally have conversations that won't affect him because he never wanted me to talk about things like this. But I do think it's important. Now, I would never do what my mother did with me. I feel almost hypocritical in a way because I am who I am, because I had such a hippie, crazy mom who felt like we're going to do a ceremony and we're going to sit in the desert. And I ended up doing everything with both of our mothers, the two of us. We went to rainbow gatherings. We sat with Ram Dass. I didn't even know we were special back then. I didn't realize that some of the people we got to sit with because of her mom were guiding the country and the world later. And so from 15 to 18, I think I tried just about everything that was for the exploration of consciousness. It wasn't recreational. Like, we definitely did ceremony around the usage of peyote and shrooms and LSD. And we didn't do it a lot. But when we did it, we knew we were tapping in. And I think that it was safer in those times. And I would never have wanted my kids or grandkids to have experimented that young. I don't think my brain was fully developed. And I saw a lot of the people that I grew up with that explored some of the same things get lost in those spaces. Another thing that was interesting, so I was 16, did the mushrooms in the desert with our mothers, and then I came back and I was a dancer, an artist and a dancer always. You know, I never thought I would have a career in the industry because my dad wanted a doctor or a lawyer, so it was always kind of the joke. This was my passion, but not what I would ultimately do. It was like sneaking off to be the artist. I think that when I was back from the trip in the desert, I ended up walking into a dance studio off Robertson. It was this incredible studio, and I thought it was a regular dance studio. And Emily Conrad Dayowd and Valerie Hunt were two women that came from UCLA, and they were doing research on movement and spinal work. Now, I don't know even what drew me in, but I was so fascinated. I wanted to work with them and be part of Continuum. That was the name of their studio. And Emily believed that, and I know that they had all done a lot of their own exploration in consciousness and medicines, but she believed that you could regenerate spinal tissue. And it was the first time I had heard of anything like that. And I had a cousin who had polio in Mexico as a kid and was in a wheelchair. And I always had this guilt that I was so blessed to have this body, always so thankful for my body. But I wanted to know, what is it with the mind and with consciousness that we can direct our bodies and make changes? And they had this whole room full of able-bodied and people in chairs doing dancing together and doing like hour-long breathing and 2-hour meditations. So she let me come and start working with them and dancing with them. And Jamie and I both ended up there. And she thought we were too young, but we were so interested that she let us come and participate. And I'm bringing that up because between my exploring psychedelics and then being in a space with adults that was so concentrated and such deep internal work that it was hard to function in a traditional high school with the kids that we were going to school with that knew nothing about our lives away from school. Right. And so that's why I said that I ended up having this interesting dual life, because I didn't feel like I could talk about my mother, who was definitely a promoter of everyone should try shrooms and everyone should do the medicine. So all these years later, at almost 60, I've come to understand that it is not for everyone. It's a gift. It's a blessing that we have these opportunities to go deeper. The plants have been a gift. And I think that it's important that we have a room like this and that we have somebody like you holding space so that those that are drawn or have an interest or want to go deeper have a support system and a network so they can synthesize and process what happens internally and how we integrate that into our daily lives. And I didn't have this back then. And so I had some rough years there that I didn't feel I could share with anybody. I felt really alone. And then as I got older and became a parent, I really, separated those worlds and didn't talk at all about my experiences when I was younger because I didn't feel it was safe. So the first time I talked publicly actually was in a room with you on Clubhouse because I said, my God, the world has opened up now and we actually get to have honest conversations about the role of psychedelics and the plant medicines. So I know I just did a whole ramble.
No, that was great. And I really appreciate you saying that because it is so critical that we have space that we hold for each other, and this is one example of ways that we can do that. But just by listening, non-judgmentally to each other and being present with each other is so important to create that safe space to talk and to just be ourselves. It's our pleasure to provide that here. I really appreciate that you feel that way. So taking all this into account, can you walk us through how you discovered Tupac Shakur?
So how did we discover each other? Let me tell you. So after I had children and I had really come to terms with, we have two different systems for education and indoctrination. I wanted to impact education. I was looking at, I can't be a teacher. And I had already, by that time, I got certified AMTA young and I'd done tons of different body work and healing work. In '84, I worked with 3 athletes that ended up in the Olympics. I was really interested in the healing arts. At, I'd say, 1988, I started looking at how I could impact education and what I could offer without doing a traditional and formal route. And I came up with that I could do assemblies in schools and do programs. And that way I could infiltrate the system without having to be of and from and part of the system. And so I came up with an idea. I had a chalkboard and I wrote all the different things that I didn't think we provided, that if I could rewrite our educational script, I would want to get up in the morning and meditate first. I'd want us to do physical things in the morning. There's a certain time of the day that math is better. And so I wrote my ideal educational script. And then I came up with this idea to work with artists to go from school to school and address this list of subjects. All of our hearts are fucked up if we haven't, done the work to have a healthy heart. Didn't matter if I was in areas of poverty, privilege, didn't matter race, gender. Most of us come in and we haven't figured out how to be emotionally healthy. So that was like, I'm going to start with the heart. The mind follows the heart. And hip hop music was exploding. My husband was a DJ and he was like, this is perfect because we're not recognized, as an art form. You can put some of the rappers I work with in your assemblies and you can do your dancing. Oh, that's what I was going to say. I was already in a band at this point. I was in a really famous Nigerian band. I was the honorary non-Nigerian member. And it was an incredible experience to tour with these brilliant African musicians. And I learned so much about African culture and community. And it was so different than anything I'd ever experienced. We couldn't even go on tour without, we had to pray before we got in the band, pray before we ate. So I suddenly was...
What was the name of the band, by the way?
Orlando Julius, Ekemode, and the Nigerian All-Stars. So Hugh Masekela and Orlando came out here in the 70s. And so Orlando is known as the godfather of world beat music. And we went on tour with Santana. And so I began to learn a whole new way of appreciating spirit and art. And so I would tour in the summer and a lot of weekends I'd do shows. And I had told everyone in the band what I wanted to do with these assemblies. And I was going to incorporate all kinds of artists. And we would use our art to have these deeper conversations and address all these topics. One more thing I forgot to tell you that's really important in terms of 60s activism and music. So my mom and some of her friends knew a man named Jack Healy. He started an organization called Amnesty International. I used to go to Jack's house when I was younger, and I saw how he was able to leverage artists who had really powerful voices, from Tracy Chapman to Sting, all these people, for his cause, which was amnesty. And I was so fascinated by the power of collaborations between causes and artists. So I wanted to duplicate what Jack was doing for the things that I felt could help change education. So I started to model what Jack was doing in a very small way and came up with this whole plan. Well, how was I going to pay and support artists that helped me? I had no money for this. And I threw an audition one day, and I had a little side backyard at an apartment in Northern California in Rohnert Park, just out of Santa Rosa. And don't know what I was thinking, but I made these little flyers and I passed them around everywhere. And I decided I was going to do these auditions in the grass field by my house. I have video footage or no one would believe me. And I've been watching it recently because we're doing the definitive Tupac documentary with Alan Hughes that's going to detail. The focus is the politics and the activism in this young poet who people, really need to take a deeper dive into. So anyway, I did this audition and hundreds of people came, and everyone in the neighborhood was like, who is this crazy person from LA who has all these artists auditioning on the side of our apartment building? So I made this list of everybody that I thought was really talented, and I came up with the idea that I would invite 7 to 10 really amazing artists, and we would start this group in my living room, and we would practice, and we put together this little tour of all the high schools. And I got an amazing group of artists, and Ray Love was one of them. He's Cab Calloway's grandson, and brilliant talent. And I kept thinking, rap is such an incredibly powerful tool to have this conversation. And so Ray was really this voice that I thought would be my primary voice in the high schools. Well, his dad came over one day to my place and said that I better not encourage his son to be in music and that it's the most toxic industry. And he told me about, their young days with Cab Calloway and that he didn't want this for his son, and basically told me that I was going to be in trouble if I helped his son. And he just terrified me. And so all of a sudden, Ray was not going to be he wasn't going to be the voice. And so there was a student in the group that was doing the high school assemblies. And she said, oh my God, there's this kid. He just moved from Baltimore and he's like a young Black male version of you. So, his name is Tupac and you're going to work with him. So for 3 months, and the thing is, I was working at a school in Marin City where Tupac was, but I didn't think that this 17-year-old knew what I was looking for. I was 25 at the time and thought I knew everything. And I figured I'm going to find the person when I do. But she kept saying, you got to come to Marin City and see this kid. And I kept saying, I need someone that understands social justice. And I love rap music, but the artists that my husband was working with were not appropriate. I'm tired of doing clean songs for the assemblies, but then you come out and hear the whole project and I'm going to be in trouble. And she said, no, this kid is the voice. So anyway, with that said, it took 3 months and me not listening. I ended up meeting Tupac and had to go tell her I was sorry, and she was so right. And sometimes we have to get out of the way of ourselves and realize that young people are much more open, and often we look to our children for the answers. So with that said, I ended up meeting Tupac, and he was like my spiritual mate. We have soul mates and mental mates. He was on a spiritual path that was so aligned with me. And that was our beginning. And that was my
Was he at Tam High at that time?
He was at Tam and not going to school.
That was my high school. We used to talk about him a lot when we were there, but of course, years later.
Oh, you went to Tam?
Yeah, I went to Tam. I graduated from Tam.
You're kidding. That's so funny. What year did you graduate?
Let's talk about that later.
Okay.
But
Graduated in 78.
yeah, I graduated much more recently. I was in, I think, 2003. But yeah, I mean, it's amazing. So you met him at this time, and then where did things go from there? You're listening to The Psychedelic Report.
My mom, sometimes it's hard to talk about how much she failed us in her parenting, and that her work in the world and her activism for women and what she wanted to do was more important than being present for her children. So what I was going to say is that at the point where I met Tupac, I was processing my mother issues and a lot of what I thought was irresponsible from parents in the 60s. And I met Tupac and we really connected on pain of our mothers in the movement and the pain of mothers who wanted to make a difference to the world, but not able to be present for their children. And then the role of addiction, because I think for many, the exploration of substance leads to more substance. And so both of our mothers began their substance use with weed and then psychedelics. And then many of our parents ended up doing cocaine. And so with Pac, at the time I met him, his mom was really struggling with her addiction. And so I just so deeply felt his pain and how let down he was by a mother who was, making a difference in her early years and succumbed to addiction. And so I think that we both wanted to change the world. We were young and dumb enough to think we could impact the entire world. We wanted to address addiction. He wanted to help his mom heal. So that was it. That was our beginning. And we literally began to create a blueprint for what we thought could change things. And Tupac always said, I'm giving you your curriculum in my songs. I am literally writing the code for changing. And that he was the heart work that was needed. And he could not see himself being alive to see the change. And I was too young at the time to understand how powerful the conversations we have inside our head. It matters how we speak to our. We were both really interested in psychedelics and consciousness. So I did do shrooms with Pac. I always feel funny talking about what people don't make public when they're not here anymore. But I do think that it is important to know that in his early development as an artist, that he did explore some and that he really believed that his music and his voice and his language was guided by a desire to change the consciousness of the planet. And before Black Lives Matter was a hashtag and a movement, that his primary commitment and goal was to help us understand why Black lives haven't mattered. And that once we recognize equity, imbalance, and what's happened specifically in this country and colonization globally, that we can begin to heal. And that all he wanted was us to have an honest conversation. And because I had a father who was in criminal defense and public defense, I saw it. You can't see race anywhere like in the courtroom or in the jails. And I spent 30 years working in San Quentin and in the prisons, having to look at what equity looks like and doesn't look like. And so that was truly my connection to Tupac, and that he was my partner in ushering in, new language and looking at emotional literacy and emotional education and financial literacy. and really this fight to change how we educate human beings. And that was definitely influenced by my early exploring and the use of psychedelics. And fast forward to ayahuasca. I don't know if we should jump into.
Well, I was just going to add one thing before you go there is that you said, I think, which focuses back to the whole reason why we're all here today, right? And why we're talking about music culture. Because what's so interesting about all of this and about especially the way that you described Pac's association with how he saw he was delivering a message through the music and giving you the code or the curriculum, as you said, this really is what music culture is about. Music evolutionarily, like we see music as today, and the way music has been changed and popularized is so different from the way that music evolved and the purpose of music, which was in very much to, number one, bring people together joyously, ideally, but bring people together. And number two, to share and pass on messages and information. Because music uniquely in our minds is very interesting. Our minds remember music better than almost anything else because music has like a way of resonating with us. And when different kinds of music or lyrics resonate with us in a certain way, just like a metaphor, but even more powerful because it has melody and it has rhythm, those things stick in our minds much better. And it's easier for us to remember them and pass them on. Prior to the internet, few things, if any, were as viral as music around the world. And so it's really important, I think, for all of us to remember that when we talk about music culture, a lot of the reasons why we have culture in the first place are because of oral traditions that were passed down through music and song and chanting, and that for thousands of years before we had the ability to write down things as effectively as we have the last couple thousand years, it was music and it was song that really helped us to share and remember all of these kinds of things that we're talking about. I'm wondering, do you see that there's maybe a link to this idea, this ancient idea of the way that the plants sing or talk to us, and passing on that message from the plants to the community was something that he took from his psilocybin experiences?
I think that it's vital that we understand the role of sound, that because mind follows heart, sound, song, poetry, language, that opens the portal to the heart. And so music is so seductive because of what it does to the cells, to the body, to the heart. And I also say that there's a cost when we put music out that does the opposite. And that's been a hard lesson too. I'm absolutely responsible for helping to market and promote violence. I participated in a lot of music that was toxic for the greater good of the long term. And I justified things that weren't healthy. I would say that part of why I talk about Tupac a lot now, and there was a time where I couldn't even talk about him. I couldn't even listen to him because we failed. And so I have to look at, how did we fail and why did we fail? And, Tupac released a song called Hit 'Em Up. I was so angry. I remember the day that I went after he recorded the song, and I wasn't managing him anymore. After 93, we kind of reversed roles, and he was helping me with a lot of stuff. But he did that song. He was so angry, and prison damaged him so much. And I heard the song and I was like, don't put that out. And he was like, I can't wait to put it out. He was almost like hyper with excitement. And so that song was a really toxic song. And there's some lines you cross that you can't take back. And there's turning points and you can see where they are. And he was a kid. He never got to become a man. And we don't see that. He had this incredible gift and more power than any teenager should ever have. And he was affected by the industry, and we become what we want to save. And that was a brutal lesson for all of us because we wanted to impact areas and people where it was needed the most. So we went straight to the heart of the most damaged and in pain communities. And when you surround yourself by pain and trauma, and when you're every day in it, it seeps into your pores. And so it was a long crawl out for me to come full circle and to process our choices and to look at what we coulda, shoulda done differently. I think those are important conversations because we don't want to repeat those things. And with music and art and consciousness, everything that comes into ourselves has an effect. And so hip hop was an eruption of trauma and pain. It was an eruption of Black struggle. And so we finally had a window through art to understand the pathology of this country and what happened. But it also was like the repeating of that trauma. And everybody wanted to participate because it was so seductive, and not everybody understood what birthed this art form. And so we could talk about this for months because it's so dense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad you brought this up. I think this is a conversation that we need to be having, which is like, what is the music trying to tell us? What are these people trying to say more often? It's a conversation that is really critical. And I think it's really interesting hearing your perspective, especially about what you went through and how, from your perspective, you perceived what the ultimate outcome was as failure, which I can absolutely understand that you would see it that way. And at the same time, the incredible art and the work that came out of what you and Tupac did together positively influenced the lives of probably hundreds of millions of people, and despite the fact that there were some songs that hit them up that probably shouldn't have been released, especially when they were, and that were really potentially damaging, there was so much goodness as well that came out of that. And I know that in some ways it is important to look at our failures objectively and without judgment so that we can understand, and really with compassion, so that we give ourselves the opportunity for growth that we deserve as a result of going through that. There's no way that we can possibly succeed at everything we do the first time. So, it's not like you guys had done anything like this before or quite in the same way. And when you're doing it, it's really up to us to do the best we can to look at ourselves and treat ourselves with compassion so that we can learn from these experiences. There's so much to learn from everything that you were just telling us. But with that, Leila, I really appreciate you taking all this time to join us today. I know you're in the middle of a move and I'm going to let you get back to that, but I just wanted to express my wholehearted gratitude for you and all the incredible work you've done and all the people you've inspired, and for taking the time to share that with us today.
Thank you. And the best thing I can offer is I could be the mistake that other people don't need to make, or just be available as somebody who's looked at the choices, and that I think that this is a really serious subject. And my request would be that people look at these choices and understand that this is work, and it's not a game, and it's not for recreational uses. This is really medicine. And I would encourage people to make their choices based on that. And it's not a party.
Where can people find you, Leila?
My email is on my page, so people can email me. I get flooded with direct messages after a room, so it takes me a little longer to look at my Instagram. I get overwhelmed by social media. But I'm good at email, and aimfortheheart.org is my nonprofit. And I'm still in the industry, although my youngest daughter, who just turned 31, is really taking over the management and telling me to go write my book. So yeah, that's part of why I just moved into this new place. I had to let go of holding on to my dad's stuff and let him be and come work on my stuff. So I'm pretty accessible.
That sounds good. And I, again, just really want to express gratitude for you taking the time. And aimfortheheart.org, everyone. Check it out. It's a really incredible nonprofit. It's done so much good. And we really are just thankful for having you. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend and a good rest of your Passover.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. Really appreciate any opportunity to spread some learning that I've done. So thank you. And thank you for this platform. I come whenever I can. I've loved some of your guests. So I'll be here on the next one as a listener.
Looking forward to having you. Take care, Leila. Have a good one, everyone.
you.
Thank you for joining us. Thanks for listening to The Psychedelic Report. Visit us at thepsychedelicreport.com. This show is recorded weekly on Clubhouse with a live audience. The Psychedelic Report was brought to you by Apollo Neuroscience and produced by Future Medicine Media and Foster House Records. While I am a doctor, I'm not your doctor. So please don't take anything you hear on the Psychedelic Report as personal medical advice, because we don't know you. If you have questions about anything you hear on this show, please consult with your doctor.